Hello everyone, welcome to the brand new first video I've ever made in 2020. There haven't been many this past week or so because massive sleep issues. So, this video is not really gonna show off anything concrete that's been heavily added to various oddities in the past, couple of weeks. Coding has been more or less the only thing I can really work on in the wake of barely sleeping at all, but I thought I might try and explain a little bit about what I've been working on, because I've been experimenting, which is always a dangerous thing, but I feel like this might be something I can maybe educate a little bit about, so we're gonna try. So what I've been experimenting with is called procedural generation. Now, if that term sounds dreadfully scary, don't worry, procedural literally just means step by step using a set of predefined rules. You can think of it as a sort of recipe. It's used inside of game design and various other things to create things with broad similarities, but which aren't identical, and that's done by altering the starting conditions. So you can kind of liken it to baking a cake and following the same exact steps, but using different ingredients. You'll end up with something roughly cake-like, but they'll be distinct based on their ingredients. So, with that in mind, I have 3 distinct things, referred to as rifts, that use different styles of procedural generation to try and create a useful structure. And there's a reason for this that I'll get into at the end of this. So the first one we are starting off with is the Mould Rift, and this one is inspired by mold spread in nature. So we start with our little block there, it creates this shell, I stand back because it's going to get a lot worse, and then, after a little while, it's just internally working out where to place things. And we should see that. Yep, there we go. Oop, yep, I was right. I was right to not trust the thing. And we see more stuff being added just all along the edges here. And that actually is where the mold is working. Because the rift at the core here is setting up the initial environments, it's basically doing a high-speed mold generation, and then the actual mold generation is more or less done by these glowstone blocks, which are then spreading out these stone slabs. These aren't actually glowstone of any kind, just by the by. It's just easy to use existing block states. And the idea here is that different positions are defined as nodes, these glowstone blocks, and they issue out this floor mold that generates other features as it goes. For instance, this strut going up the middle, and then these ceiling pieces that come across the top here as well. And all of that is based on rules, saying what can go where. And it does need a limiting factor, which is why we have that shell generated first, because otherwise it will go endlessly into the horizon. There's not really a stopping point here. In nature, in real-world mold, it tends to go as long as it has a sufficient source of food, and it will just then continue looking for the next piece of food. Here we actually just want it to be in place, which is why this doesn't quite work for what we're looking for as structures. But it is very thorough, and it can create extremely diverse kind of structures. But as we can maybe tell from up here, it frequently makes ones that you can't actually navigate through. There's nothing in here that says this location should be a set of stairs, this location should be a doorway, that kind of thing. It is possible to add those in, but you still end up with extremely hectic kind of structures. And the more pressing matter, really, is that we are currently running at tick speed 1000. If we actually dial this down to tick speed 3, which is what it usually is, random tick speed, the game rule, this takes forever, which is why the Rift does that initial big bulk kind of generation, because it would otherwise basically be a case of we put it down and the players would basically never see a full actual thing. So we actually want to make sure that we can do that, which brings us to the next thing. So here we are in our next test world. All of these were developed inside of specific ones, and pretty much all of these do have some degree of, fitting to an actual terrain world, but it's easiest to actually test out how things work initially just in a flatlands. So here we have the Tendril Rift, and this one, much as in the Mould Rift was inspired by mold spread, this one has actually been inspired by tree roots, and it's going to take much longer to get started because this actually is setting up an entire blueprint, which it then generates up. We will see that momentarily, most probably. And the generation for this one is centered on the Rift block itself instead of each individual block, so it can work a lot faster. We don't have to wait for all of the mold to, spread out by the random ticks of blocks, that kind of thing. And the way this works is... oh, there we go. the Rift generates a series of tendrils at random orientations and sizes, and each tendril is then given its starting size and direction, and then it works out from that, randomly shifting them down, so the rotation changes around, and the size randomly decreases based upon a RNG specific to that particular tendril. And after a certain distance from the core or a certain size, they just mark themselves as complete, and then they fill in their entries in the blueprint for the Rift, which allows us to have intersecting tunnels as well. Now, it's very atmospheric. It certainly looks very organic. We can see that working quite nicely. And the fact that it populates the blueprint rather than having to be waiting just for the mold to do itself allows us to actually do some very special things later on. But the major problem is that it's difficult to really populate with specific points of interest. So, like, the libraries and strongholds are a good example. Places where blazes are and nether fortresses, those are all, like, good examples of points of interest inside of a structure. So it's a good way of creating pathways, but it doesn't really do much else. So this we can sort of say that this is like a road. It doesn't really necessarily have an interesting thing to it, it's just a way of getting from one to the other, and that's the problem with the Tendril Rift, is that it works very fast, it makes a very good cohesive kind of structure, but doesn't actually have any purpose to it that we can really even remotely begin to define. So, onto the last of our free rifts. So here we are, once again, in a fresh little testing world, and here we have maybe some idea of what maybe is about to happen, and I'm just gonna place down our third rift of the day, which is the Procedural Rift, or Jigsaw Rift, as it's occasionally known, more just for people to understand what it is. So I place that down, and we see stuff beginning to pop in around us, and after a point it's finished. And, nope, still going. Okay, so, this form of procedural generation is the most common style, and it's often used for generating dungeons in roguelike games, as well as a lot of Minecraft's own structures, like the fortresses, the strongholds, and more recently things like villages. And it's based off all of these discrete components being randomly selected and put into place. In this case, there is a lot of control as to what can go where, which is quite how we end up with this very intricate kind of structure. And, all of these different components have different connectors, so we're able to say that this particular piece has these 4 connectors all around, this one only has the 3, others have like 2, one of these levels even only has 1, that kind of thing, and those can then connect onto other things, so maybe this next thing has 3 points like this, and it can go in that direction and that direction, but this one's occupied, so then it just goes on and on like that, and it fits things together by rotating them, spinning them, and seeing if there's any way that they can fit. So, the first thing that we generate for this is this central core of white concrete with the glowstone running down. We call this the cores, and these are generated to provide ample starting points to build out from, to basically ensure that this particular structure actually gets somewhere as opposed to just petering out after the first point. It also gives us a nice little focal point that we know is going to be present in all of these structures. And then there are 2 points of interest currently generating in the system. We can easily add more, but they are the hatchery and the storage, which might give you some idea as to what exactly this is. But here we have that these are terminators. They only have 1 entryway point, and here we have the one going to that way. Here's another one coming from the same direction. There's a storage coming from that direction. All of these things fitted in nicely. This is looking for either having at least as many hatchery structures as it has initial cores, or hitting a certain predefined limit of parts. As long as both of those conditions are met and it hasn't run out of places to go, it will happily continue expanding. It does have a hard limit on how far away it can expand. And that really is the wonderful, wonderful thing about this particular style of generation. It is extremely controllable. It is very fast. The main problem, though, is it struggles with fine detail, which is understandable because it's basically using the exact same half dozen or so building blocks and repeating them over and over and over, and it's just rotating them. So it's not very distinct. If you were to walk around in a structure like this by these pathways, you would basically see the exact same thing over and over, like a repeating background in a cartoon, essentially. So this is really powerful. As we can see, we generated this big old structure very quickly. And it also is populating a blueprint inside of the rifts, so everything there everything there was generating as we looked at it, but the whole thing is actually stored inside of the rift, so if we want to have it generate entirely and then build afterwards, we can do that as well. Okay. So, to summarize, we have 3 different styles of step-by-step production of structures. We have mold, tendrils, and we have jigsaws. And all of them have their own little, advantages and disadvantages. Mold is very slow, but it's very thorough. Tendril is quick and atmospheric, but it's also not actually very good at making detail, or, anywhere to actually go. It just goes wherever it wants to go. And then Procedural is very good at very quick, very complex structures, but it struggles at fine detail, so you'll find things to, enjoy inside the place, but every corridor is going to look pretty much identical. So, with that in mind, let me finally introduce exactly what I've been experimenting with this stuff for, and that is, simply put, hives. So, there are ant hives, there are beehives, there's all sorts of different hives in nature. These particular ones are being engineered for the purposes of creatures known as changelings. And other structures are probable in the future, so we could have ant-like formian nests or giant beehives, that kind of thing, but these are just meant for changelings. And changelings and the rifts that build their hives are intended to be added as part of the endgame for the Witch Patron Pact for Warlocks. And the Warlock system is very nascent at the moment. I'm trying to make it so that you can configure it much like a resource pack, that kind of thing, but it's a little difficult to actually make sure that works because it needs to rely on a lot of things that are very similar to achievements but don't actually, unfortunately, are able to clip into them, that kind of thing. It's a mess. But this I've been tinkering with because it's very interesting. I'm not very familiar with procedural generation and that kind of thing, and this is to add extra difficulty. These hives need to be progressively constructed on top of existing terrain. I can't just glue them into natural world generation, because these have to be placed at places that you have already been whilst progressing the Patron Pact. So, yeah. It's very, very tricky. So the current plan is that we'll use this jigsaw system to get the majority of the structure laid out, and then all of the points of interest will be laid out by structure files, probably more than one kind of structure file. Probably I'm going to try and allow for much bigger kind of rooms than this is, that kind of thing. And from there, the roads here that we see of the jigsaw pieces and such will be completely stripped out and replaced with tendril generation. So instead of just this straight line, we'll actually have each individual piece will have its own RNG, and it will try and generate tendrils going into those different locations in a similar fashion, a little bit more rotationally controlled than the tendril system actually is right now, that kind of thing. So each individual piece will actually be individually unique and distinct, and then to really glue everything together and give it some really nice fine detail as you're going through the tunnels, we're going to be using the mold generation to create much more glued together tendrils, as well as to give interior detail to the actual tendrils. So you'll have lighting, you'll have dripping from above. The closest example I can give to what I want these changeling hives to look like is a xenomorph hive, surprising absolutely nobody, because I'm a massive nerd when it comes to Alien. But yeah, that's the plan. I don't know how much of this I'll have done before we finally get to 114, but yeah, look out for this. If I do manage to get this done for by the time I have 114 going, then I will include this, so if you want to just hop into creative mode or something and drop down a rift, that'll be something you can do. But for now, hope you learned a little bit today, and I shall, as ever, catch you all next time.